really is an honor to be here with you all today, having such a global presence. And this is a topic that I really enjoy and I've done a lot of work with. So I'm hoping that I can share what I have with you and we can collaborate and everyone can learn together. So just gonna click through the slide here. Oh, okay, there we go. So a little slow on the response, but just a little quick outline. We have kind of two parts of this talk. So the first part is spot checking your commissioning data. This is going to be kind of more of the overview of things. And then we're going to dive deep into tweaking your treatment planning system and looking at DLG and MLC transmission. When we talk about fine-tuning your algorithm, what we're going to be really fine-tuning is the agreement between measured and planned doses for IMRT and VMAT delivery. And so the dosimetric leaf gap, that's the DLG, the MLC transmission, these are key parameters that we can tweak and adjust to improve the agreement. And our goal is to make sure that our planning system represents what we're actually delivering at the machine, as we know. So within these sections, we're going to look at the Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A report. This is a really nice summary of what we can do to validate an algorithm. And then we're also going to look at some practical things with tweaking the treatment planning system beam model. So let's dive in the learning objectives. And so one moment here, okay. And then, so one, we want everyone to be able to perform a comprehensive but quick spot check of the commissioning data. This is huge. So we want to make sure that it's quick, so it's not, too burdensome, but comprehensive, so we don't have any blind spots in our program, because our treatment planning system is the foundation of what we're doing when we're treating cancer patients with a LINAC. So that's step one. Step two, we want to understand the detailed step-by-step process of how to adjust these parameters, the dosimetric leaf gap, DLG, and the MLC transmission in the treatment planning system. So this should all be referenced to your clinic's data. And the third is maybe not as obvious, but it's super, super important. So we want to be able to execute the logistics and team communications needed to safely fine-tune the commissioning. So we know that our treatment planning system is being used clinically most of the time when we're trying to bring up a new algorithm. And so part of it, this whole process, is to make sure that we can make adjustments to test, but not affect the clinical operations day to day. And so we'll go over some strategies in that regard. So if this doesn't make sense yet, that's totally fine. We're going to go through this at the end. We want to be able to know and be able to satisfy these objectives. And if we don't, we'll ask some questions and we'll go through it together. So first, spot checking your commissioning data. And feel free to stop me, as Philip said, whenever. This is a totally collaborative discussion. Before we do that, we're going to go into a Zoom poll. So this one, I'll just read through and then we'll give you some time to formulate an answer. So the dosimetric leaf gap, DLG, represents A, the difference in the physical leaf end and the dosimetric field edge. B, the minimum gap that is possible for an MLC system. C, the width of the sweeping gap field used during measurements. Or D, the width of the penumbra of an MLC-defined field. And so we have the poll live. I'm seeing some answers come in. Looks like we have over 30, almost 40, 50 responses. 58, all right.
Give it maybe another 15, 20 seconds. Let people respond.
Awesome.
Yeah, getting.
Holy cow, there's a, yeah, that's awesome. Okay.
Trickling in. Alrighty, I'll end the poll and share. Looks like most people went with A.
Okay, so just thinking through these, so we have the dosimetric leaf gap is actually a parameter in the planning system. It's used to model the rounded leaf edge. And I apologize, I don't have a slide for it, but there's the physical leaf end, which is the very tip of the rounded leaf end. And then there's actually the sort of the dosimetric end, which takes into account the rounding. And so I'm not sure if I can advance. So that's the highlighted answer. And I can share more info on this. I don't have a slide, unfortunately, for it, but that's the idea. So, all right, we're going to move on, I think. I'm going to minimize the poll. It looks like 54% answered A. We had 25% B, 12% C, and 9% D. All right. Okay. So let's see if I can. All right. So Philip, do you know how I can minimize the toolbar at the top of the window? Feel silly to
I
ask, but
don't actually know how to minimize that. Usually I thought disappears when can you move it to like the top? Or I guess it's
nice.
probably in the way.
I moved it to the bottom, so that's perfect. Awesome. Thank you. So starting off, so remember this section is spot checking, like a quick and comprehensive spot check of your planning system. So MPPG, the Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A, was published in 2015. So the overall task for this group and this report was to give like a comprehensive set of tests. It's really tailor-made for the starting point of this lecture. I really like this document. We use this document in our clinic to guide what tests we do to make sure that we have our bases covered when we're commissioning a new algorithm, a new machine. So it really does cover many aspects of algorithm performance in a comprehensive, clear, and concise way. To give you an idea of the scope of the document, if you haven't read this document yet, it goes over data acquisition and processing, as well as the algorithm validation for both photon and electron beams. So going from basic model validation, heterogeneity correction validation, which we're not going to include in this lecture, is in this document, and then also IMRT VMAT dose validation. So I'm going to go over in a little bit more depth some of the items within this document. It really does a nice job of laying out what we need to do to validate an algorithm. So here are the different tables. So table 3 through 7. So table 3 covers the basic validation of the beam model, very foundational, quick checks of the beam model. And then table 4 goes into a more in-depth validation of the 3D CRT delivery. So this is static MLC, jaw-defined fields, wedges, these sorts of things. And we're going to measure the dose agreement in the high dose region, the penumbra, and the out-of-field region. Table 5 just summarizes what the dose agreement tolerances are that they recommend, which is very important. You know, how do we know if there's sufficient agreement? Table 6, as I mentioned, we're not going to cover that today. We're going to actually leave that for, you can review that, but not in this lecture. And then table 7 goes through the IMRT and VMAT validation. So that does include TG119 and clinical case validation. There's a few other elements as well. So we're going to go into this in a little bit more depth. So this is table 3, so just copied from the report itself. And so I've just given a little bit more detail here, or kind of in my own words, what each test is, and then we'll go over what they would look like in the planning system in the next slide. So for this 5.1 test, we're going to compare the PD and profile for large fields, like a 30 by 30 field, 40 by 40 field, just comparing calculated versus measured. For 5.2, that test, we're going to calculate a plan in the TPS directly mimicking our calibration conditions and make sure that we're calculating what we calibrated the LINAC to give in terms of output. So at my clinic, we calibrate our LINACs to give 1 centigrade per monitor unit with a 10 by 10 field, 100 cm SSD at Dmax depth. And so for our clinic, we would set up a plan, 10 by 10 field, 100 SSD, and see what the dose is at Dmax if we give 100 MU. Nothing too complicated, but we want to make sure this is a sanity check for the planning system. And then 5.3 is this quick check of PDD and output factor. So you can mimic what you've already done. You do not need new measurements for these tests. They're just quick sanity checks. Okay, looks like we're missing some text there, but yeah, we don't need new measurements here. So this is an example of 5.1. This is within Eclipse. This is the config workspace beam configuration. And this is comparing for a large field, profile here, PDD should match exactly, you know, and they appear to match very, very well. Okay. That's 5.1, 5.2, again, just directly mimicking our calibration conditions and making sure as a sanity check for our planning system that we're on the right track. So here it's telling me that I'm delivering 1.001 gray for 100 MU. And so that is certainly within the tolerance, which is 0.5% that they recommend. So it may not be exact, but it should be very close, within 0.5%. And then this is an example of comparing a 40 by 40 field at 10 cm depth just comparing the treatment planning system dose profile to the measured dose profile. And so here the AAA calculated is the blue is what we calculated in the planning system. We took a line profile at the correct depth and the correct orientation for the phantom geometry. We copied that over to Excel and we compared it to our measured profile. So nothing too complicated, but this verifies that the treatment planning system is actually calculating something that matches what we measured when we're using the same geometry. And so that's 5.1, 5.2, 5.3. Those are going to give us some like baseline, just like, are we in the right range with our model? And then 5.4 through 5.9 are going to give us a better idea of how our planning system's handling things like MLC blocking, different depths, different parts of the dose distribution. So we're going to measure the absolute dose at several points for each of these test fields, test plans. So we're going to go kind of a shallow depth, a little bit beyond Dmax, mid-range depth, and deep depth. So they give guidelines for these depths. So you could do like 5 cm, 10 to 15 cm, 25 to 30 cm, something like that. And then we're also going to use different off-axis positions. So we're going to be in the high dose, in the penumbra, and in the low dose. And we have these fields, so we don't have to memorize these. Let's go in. I'll go in deeper depth of how we set up our plans to do these tests. So this is 5.4.
Sorry, Stephen, to interrupt real quick, but on that last point, we had a question that might be good to clarify real quick. Considering a dose distribution, what region is actually regarded as the high dose region versus low dose region? Like, what's the difference there?
Oh, great question. So I'm going to go back into this slide. So can you see my pointer, my mouse?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this would be the high dose region, kind of like this inner. So if this is the field edge, the 50% isodose line right here, and right here, like the inner 80% of that field size is going to be the high dose region. And then this is the penumbra, going from 20% to 80% of the sort of high dose value or the central axis. So here's the penumbra on this side. And out of field is going to be over here, not really shown in the plot. That's what we're talking about. And I'm actually going to go back to 5.2. So in this example, this is along the central axis. So this would be the high dose region in this region here. This is going to be the penumbra, right where the field is defined on both sides. And this is the out of field region. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. Yeah. Hopefully that answered Nicholas's question. Thank you.
Awesome. Good question. Yeah. So then we can move into these tests just to give you an idea.
Sorry.
Oh. Go ahead.
Could you please, you have to explain, could you please explain about this software? This is a free software, MMP5 or?
Yeah. Good question. Yeah. So MPPG 5A was like a task group or a committee. There was a committee that was then asked to create a report on this topic, on the photon and electron algorithm conditioning. So MPPG 5A, I have a link. It's a paper that's available, a report that's available, published in 2015, open access. I have a link in the slide itself, and then also in the references. So it's this OI link here, and so it's available to anyone. And it will have these tables as well as a more comprehensive report.
That's good.
I just threw it in the chat as well if you want to click on it, if you can, to check it out.
Yeah, that's free software. We can download it and we can use it for comparing PDD and profile and output. I
don't know if there's free software for that. I usually just use a spreadsheet myself.
Yes.
The report is free. I'm not aware of any resources in that regard to do the analysis, but if you find it, that's great.
Yes, thank you.
And so looking at some of these tests, so test 5.4 is a small MLC defined field. And so just very simple, just a square MLC aperture, a 4x4 aperture with a 5x5 jaw setting. And we're going to do measurements at the various points that we talked about, different depths, different parts of the field, high dose, penumbra, low dose. And same with 5.5. We're going to do a larger MLC defined field. It's going to be complex blocking. And in 5.6 and 5.7, we can actually use the same field. We have the MLC aperture here. These leaves are extended all the way, the maximum extent. And then we have this sort of half beam block with the MLC. And then we can do these at different SSDs to satisfy 5.6 and 5.7. So it's, fairly straightforward to do these. Setting up a water tank, you can have these fields defined and then have the measurement points defined, and then you're set up for success with that. And so the other tests are pretty straightforward. So 10 by 10 field at an oblique instance, so just a gantry angle introduced instead of being on phos or at gantry 0. And then whatever we're working with wedges, just also verifying those as well. Okay. There's some other samples in the literature, and then you have the MLC aperture from these slides. So hopefully that helps if you do these tests. And you can create your own tests that satisfy these conditions. It's very open-ended, but you can also use something very similar or the same as these. When you do the testing, the MPPG 5A report offers some recommended tolerance values. So they created these to be consistent with IROC Houston. So this is, the main supplier of anthropomorphic phantoms and output verification and a bunch of other services that really allow us to be consistent within the medical physics community. So within the high dose region, they recommend a 2% tolerance. You have one parameter change from reference conditions. So that'd be like reference conditions are 10 by 10 field size, 100 cm SSD, Dmax depth. So if you change the SSD, change the field size, et cetera, if you only do one change, that's the 2% tolerance. If you have multiple parameter changes, they recommend a 5% tolerance. So 2% or 5% for the high dose region is their recommended tolerance. The penumbra, they recommend a distance to agreement of 3 millimeters. And then for the low dose tail, they recommend a 3% tolerance, but that's relative to the maximum field dose, not a strict dose difference, but a dose difference with the normalization to the maximum field dose. So those are the tolerances. And then moving into the VMAT and IMRT summary. So these tests are in addition to the tests that we saw from table 3 and 4. So I'm just going to give my opinion on this. I think the most important tests that we see here are the TG119 and clinical tests. So it's kind of like a PSQA style measurement chamber and hopefully a planar dose measurement that we can use to fine-tune our beam model and to validate and then fine-tune our beam model. But within the MPPG report does recommend that we verify a small field PDD, verify some output factors for small MLC defined fields, and then move into the TG119 and clinical tests, and then the external review. If you can do an anthropomorphic phantom irradiation, these are available from a variety of sources, then that's a very good indicator of the performance of your algorithm. And it's an objective measure of the accuracy of your trend planning system. So just to summarize, so when we do validation testing for kind of scanning and open field measurements, we have our scanning data. So we'll verify profiles using flatness and symmetry for a variety of field sizes and depths. So you could do like small, mid-size, and large field sizes at depth of Dmax 10 cm and 30 cm for validation. Usually what I look at is making sure the symmetry is less than 1% for profiles. The flatness is dependent on the physics of the beam itself. The symmetry we want to make sure is good and as close to 0 as we can get. Verifying the PDD in the same way for the small, mid-size, and large field sizes. And if you think about the workflow of your commissioning, you can actually include some of those MLC-defined small field PDDs that are in MPPG 5A test 7.1. You can include those in your scanning setup so that just to increase the efficiency and throughput of your commissioning effort. So the key thing here is whenever you're scanning for small field PDD, you want to use an appropriate detector such as a diode. So for output factors, we can verify the agreement between the calculated and measured output factors for a variety of field sizes. So you want to cover the range of field sizes that you're going to be using or that are possible to be used. And it's very simple. Just you can mimic the measurement geometry in the treatment planning system, whatever SSD you use, whatever depth, calculate the different field sizes, and then compare the planning system result to the output factor measurement result. And again, very important to use appropriate detectors for the field sizes that you're using. And so just a little bit about TG119 and clinical case PSQA. This is on the right, we just see some different views. So sagittal view and an axial view of the phantom geometry. This is the C-shaped plan. So you see the C-shaped target and the cord. So we're trying to provide dose to the target and avoid the cord. Here, this is the mock prostate plan. So this is supposed to be mimicking what a prostate would look like with bladder and rectum. And so TG119, planning guide, the reporting form, and structure sets can all be found on the AAPM website. I've provided the link here, and so we can make that available too. There should be a link in the references slide as well at the end of this presentation. So this is the original TG119 data set. It includes the C-shaped plan, the mock prostate plan you see, as well as mock head neck plan and multi-target plan. And so these are the TG119 plans. We also have additional plans for testing that we get from our own clinic. So at your clinic, you have certain things that you typically treat, and you want to make sure that things that are typically treated are included in your validation testing roster. So if you treat a lot of lung, if you treat a lot of prostate, if you treat a lot of head and neck or a lot of brain, whatever you're treating with IMRT and VMAT, let's include that in the validation testing cases. And then we're going to have a robust way to validate our planning system and to fine tune it as we need to. So the one note here is that the TG119 in clinical cases, we're using those to tweak the model. So let's make sure they're good plans. What I mean by good plans is that they're performed by staff that would typically do the planning for a real patient, that the plans are optimized as they would be for a real patient, that the modulation and these other things, they're all done in a quality way that would be consistent with the workflow you would use for real patient treatments. So in fact, if you have a dosimetrist, then this is the time to get them involved. If you do the planning, then this is the time for you to plan these cases. And then we can use the measurement data to tweak the model. All right. So now, okay, so that's all background, kind of fun, but this is the real fun stuff where we can actually see the model improve. We get a better level of agreement, and we're starting to understand the different parameters in the planning system that we can use to have a more accurate model. So, and this is my favorite part too. So just a little bit of overview for this section. So we have the MLC, DLG, and transmission. Again, this is the dosimetric leak gap, the DLG. We're going to go over what the effect is on the dose distribution for the various delivery modalities. So this includes static fields, IMRT, and VMAT. And when I talk about IMRT, I'm speaking in terms of static gantry IMRT. So it's like sliding window delivery. And then I'll just provide some practical overview and tips on MLC parameter adjustment. This is just from my experience, not necessarily from a specific task group report. Hopefully this info helps you. Then I'll talk about how to create a new commissioning machine for your testing. I'll go over what the workflow would be in ARIA or in Eclipse, which is the planning system that my institution uses. And then we'll take a look at how to actually adjust the DLG and MLC transmission, step-by-step process, how to adjust these within the TPS, and then you can reference your clinic's data after going through this. And then go through a practical dry run of adjusting model parameters with realistic clinical data. So just an example from my clinic. All right. So what is the effect on the dose distribution when we change the DLG and the MLC transmission? All right. So first, for static fields, so just so we don't get confused, I put, what parameter is changing. So hopefully the legend for these plots help. And we're going to go through different field types. So this is just static fields, MLCs, as you see in the upper right. When we change the DLG, this is what's actually changing. It's not changing anything in the central field, the high dose region. For a static field, it's actually changing the field edge. This makes sense just based on the definition of DLG. All right, so that's for a static field, changing the DLG. If we change the MLC transmission for a static field, it doesn't really change the high dose region or the penumbra, but it is changing this out of field region. Okay, that's just making a change from 1.6 to 2.5% for the MLC transmission. It's a pretty drastic change in MLC transmission, but I chose those numbers to illustrate this example, okay? So that's static fields, DLG, and MLC transmission. Now We go to a more complicated setup. We have DLG being changed for IMRT delivery. And I actually have a few slides here just to really highlight what's happening. So here's the DLG for 0.14, so a variety of values, essentially. And so what we see is the lowest DLG value is this lighter blue. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to see, but darker blue and then orange. And so we see that the DLG, when it's increased, it increases the high dose region, the amplitude of the high dose region. It also changes a little bit in the penumbra. Okay, this is IMRT delivery, MLC DLG, and this is what we just talked about with changing the high dose magnitude as well as a slight change in the penumbra width. Visually, the change in the high dose magnitude or the amplitude is more substantial than the penumbra width change. All right, so that was DLG for IMRT delivery. That's sliding window delivery, static gantry IMRT. And then this is MLC transmission effect for IMRT delivery. And we see it's actually similar, at least in the behavior, to the DLG change. And so we see a change in the high dose amplitude. We see a little bit of change in the penumbra width. All right, so now we're moving on to the DLG effect for VMAT delivery. So I really am trying to emphasize which parameter we're changing and which type of delivery, because it matters quite a bit. And we see here, just note below, these are the same DLG values that we used for the IMRT delivery example before. You see the effect is definitely a lot less. So the effect on the dose distribution in the high dose region and in the penumbra is just the DLG change has quite a bit less of an effect. And just zooming in a little bit, so it's a lot less of an effect for this plan. That's with VMAT delivery, that's DLG. And then for leaf transmission, it's a very similar behavior. All right, so that's just to give you a little bit of background on when we change the DLG and MLC transmission, what effect does it have on the different types of deliveries? And then hopefully it's a good reference for you moving forward when you're thinking about these things, maybe even years down the road. So it was actually a lot of fun to put that data together to just highlight how these things, the effect of these parameters changes with the different types of delivery. So, all right, so moving on. Next, we're going to talk about how to create a new commissioning machine in your treatment planning system and adjust the DLG and MLC transmission so you can adjust the model and see if you can get better agreement. So the general idea, before we get into the nuts and bolts here, is to create a copy of the machine and then create a copy of the B model and adjust the parameters to improve the agreement. So if you want to create a commissioning machine in ARIA, one easy way to do it, relatively easy, is just to utilize the RT admin workspace. You can select the machine that you'd like to copy, and then you can actually just export that machine. It'll export it into an XML format, save it in a directory, and then you can re-import it. So step 2 would be re-import it, name it appropriately, and then you can name it something like test physics if that is what you're looking for within your workflow. And then just to clarify kind of what that machine will be used for. And then the next step would just be to ensure that all the MLC add-on information is complete. When you re-import that new machine, MLC information will be blank. This is a safety measure. It won't automatically assume the add-on material or the dosimetric properties. And so you'll have to enter those. And so you'll just need the current numbers from the current model as a starting point would be my recommendation. If you want to create a copy of the beam model, it's kind of a similar idea. In the beam config workspace, you can select your new machine, the correct energy, correct algorithm, insert new beam data, and you can actually copy existing data to the calculation model and select the model that you wish to copy. This model should be the same type of algorithm. So AAA 11030, for instance, okay, or whatever model you're using. And then you want to match and assign the add-ons, make sure that they're selected as in use. So the open field and also the EDW, and then you can approve it so to ensure that you can calculate with this machine. One key point, whenever you're doing this, never, never, never select assign. Okay, that's going to link the beam data. Any changes you make to this one would then affect the other one. Not select assign. That's my blanket recommendation. if you're an ARIA user or an Eclipse user. So, but this is how you could create beam model. The process would not be the exact same in another treatment planning system, but you could consult with a vendor to perform a similar operation. Okay, so all right, so that's like how to create like a separate commissioning machine, a separate commissioning beam model. Let's look at some practical overview and tips on the adjustment for these MLC parameters. So how do I even adjust these things? Well, if you have ARIA version 13 or later, you can do this in the RT admin workspace. So if you make the adjustments there, it's actually right here. This is in RT admin, and right at the bottom right of the screen, you can define the dosimetric properties, the transmission factor, and the DLG. So this will define these values for all beam models for this machine. So proceed with caution, but this is where you can define it for ARIA version 13 and later. For ARIA version 11 and earlier, you would define these values in the beam config workspace. So you go to beam data, dosimetric data, and then enter the MLC transmission and the DLG. For other treatment planning systems, I can't go over all those right here, but you would want to consult with the vendor either via the manual or their help desk for instructions on how to change these types of parameters, okay?
Maybe, Stephen, this is a good time to ask real quick, if you know, we're getting some questions about if there is a DLG, DLS concept in other TPSs, or is it variant specific? Like, I'm not actually familiar with Monaco, but there's a question about Monaco or Electa MLC. And another question is, why don't we measure DLG in Electa machines, though it's mandatory for variant? So maybe could you explain if DLG is present in every planning system, or is it a vendor specific thing?
So DLG is a variant term. So dosimetric leaf gap is a term that's used by variant. So the different vendors have different ways to account for this behavior of a rounded leaf edge and also the MLC transmission. I'm not sure how Monaco handles it, but every vendor has to have some way to distinguish between, you know, the difference between the dosimetric leaf end and the physical leaf end. So each vendor should have pretty extensive descriptions of how they do this. In the variant manual, it goes pretty, very nice like images and figures to give you a conceptual idea of how this works. And so, but the Electa machine or a different type of machine with a different type of planning system, you may not need to measure DLG, and it may be a different type of parameter that's used to model the MLCs and therefore to also to tweak the dose delivery.
Gotcha. So I guess just to summarize, it's a real ubiquitous phenomenon that's, I guess, called different things in different planning systems, but DLG, I guess, is the most common, just because I guess variant is probably the most commonly used environment. So hopefully that clarifies that. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. So this is the overview, just kind of this iterative process to tweak your algorithm. So we've already gone over the MPPG 5A. And essentially, I look at this MLC parameter and the beam model optimization process. It's just like any other optimization process. It's an iterative set of steps that we're going to go through to improve whatever it is we're trying to improve. In this case, we're going to improve the agreement between measured and calculated doses for IMRT and VMAT plans. So overall, the process is something like this. So you acquire the initial measurements for the MLC parameters. In our case, we've been looking at DLG. So we'll acquire, measure the DLG. We'll also calculate the beam model, and we'll generate and calculate these IMRT or VMAT plans for verification. So one note here is that when you're generating these verification plans for conventional planning, you're going to use your TG119 plans and some previous clinical plans. For SRS SBRT planning, it is absolutely critical to use SRS SBRT plans with the verification data set. And I'll show you just one slide to highlight the importance there, but just really recognize that if this algorithm is going to be used for SRS SBRT, we need to really validate it using SRS SBRT plans. And just for all of these clinical cases, we want to make sure that the treatment plans are set up to meet the actual clinical goals and constraints so that we're actually validating the algorithm with something that's meaningful in terms of the plan. So we'll have point dose measurements and planar dose measurements. Ideally, I'm going to focus on the point dose measurements. I found those to be the most helpful for validating the algorithm. And we just want to make sure that we're selecting the proper detector. So something with a small volume ion chamber. So we typically are using a CC01 or pinpoint chamber at my clinic. We're going to take this chamber and use it to generate high dose readings and low dose readings. So this is simulating the target volume and the organs at risk. As I mentioned, we're going to use these as a primary means for MLC parameter adjustment and selection. And then we also have the planar dose measurements. So we typically use gap chromic film for this. You can use an array type device like the map check, or even a portal dosimeter can be used in this regard. Okay, so that's just kind of an overview of kind of like how the tweaking process can work, or the overall and then process for putting a V model in, and then also acquiring the measurements. Some practical points just from my experience. Some of this might be a little bit redundant, but I just want to emphasize the importance of each of these items. And so we want to use real IMRT and VMAT plans to validate the V model. We want to, if we have the ability to do planar dose analysis, include both point dose and planar dose analysis. So just a little like thought on when is the model good enough. So TG119, what they did is they used the concept of a confidence limit to characterize QA results. So the confidence limit, the definition here is the mean value plus 1.96 times the standard deviation. And so for their high dose point measurements, they found the confidence limit from their data was like plus or minus 4.5%. And for low dose, 4.7%. And then for gamma analysis, 3%, 3 millimeter, the confidence limit was greater than about 88%. So you can also calculate the confidence limit for your data and compare to TG119. So not just the individual results, but the confidence limit, which takes into account the whole distribution. TG218, which is tolerance limits and action limits for pretreatment QA, they recommend a tolerance limit of 2% for ion chamber measurements and gamma analysis, 3%, 2 millimeter, greater than 95%. And an action limit as well. Although I think this might be, I think action limit probably is a little bit less strict. I think this may be a typo. So I need to follow up on that one. The overall idea is to get the average percent difference, our data as close to 0% as we can. So we're looking to just get our overall agreement between calculated and measured as close to 0 as we can. We want to minimize the spread in the QA results as well. And if we can compare to other institutions or literature with a similar type of setup, similar LINAC, similar to treatment planning system, that's also a good thing. And we should try to do that if we can. If possible, really recommend independent audit, whether it's an IAEA, IROC Houston, some type of anthropomorphic canon to validate our planning system from an external audit perspective. And then how much can you tweak the treatment planning system values? So my preference, my opinion, my experience, tweak as little as possible so that you can get the agreement that fulfills the clinical goals of the machine. So that's just my preference. I can go into that a little bit more, but that's how I treat it. All right, so looking at like how do we interpret these results for IMRT, VMAT delivery, et cetera. So here in this example, we have the red profile in the lower right. That's the planned dose. The blue is the film dose. And so we're delivering hot. So we're delivering cold, I should say. Sorry. The planned dose is higher than the film dose. So in this case, we would want to consider decreasing the dosimetric leap gap and MLC transmission values. An increase. So the overall idea is an increase in DLG is going to increase the calculated dose, as we noted before, and an increase in the MLC is also going to increase the calculated dose. All right. So in this case, we would consider decreasing the DLG and or the MLC transmission to improve agreement just for the specific plan. But we're going to go over a more comprehensive evaluation in just a little bit. And so just to go over this kind of from a different perspective, when we do this whole sort of process, treatment planning, we're going to develop a good quality plan using the test plan structure set. As I mentioned, let's have whoever does the treatment planning for your institution, let's have them develop the plan if possible. And then the QA plan, we're going to take that treatment plan, map it onto a phantom, and then hopefully perform both chamber and planar dose measurements. You can see some choices for phantoms. We typically just use solid water, but there may be others that you're utilizing. So we measure the QA plan, compare to the predicted dose from the treatment planning system, compile all the test results before making any adjustments. And please know that the trend that you see for IMRT and VMAT can be quite different. And so we want to compile all the results, and then we'll have a game plan for how we can adjust and test this further. Okay. So I'll just go through a practical dry run. So this is real clinical data. The starting point was just the measured DLG value of 0.115 and 1.65% for MLC transmission, 0.115 cm for the DLG. This is a 10x energy using IMRT and VMAT. And so we have 3 TG119 cases for both IMRT and VMAT. We have 2 clinical cases for both of those. So in total, 10 cases that we're using to validate the MLC parameters. Again, the selection of the parameters really depends on the clinical goals for the beam model. What disease sites are we going to be treating? What modality are we going to be treating? And then also trends in the data. So how can we minimize the percent difference between measured and planned doses? Which parameter values will minimize the spread in the results? So that kind of the average agreement and also the standard deviation, and also paying attention to outliers in the data. How can we minimize those? All right, so this is sort of the iterative step-by-step. And so this is kind of a busy slide, and you don't need to pay attention to every single thing. This is kind of more for reference, the bulk majority of the numerical data. But just to kind of go through it a little bit, we have VMAT, IMRT, we have the different plan types, we have the measured point dose, calculated dose, and percent difference for both the high dose and the low dose. Okay, and then here, the blue and the orange are the high dose for VMAT and IMRT. Green and the yellow are the low dose for VMAT and IMRT. That's the average agreement value. Okay, and then the other data, these are the individual data points, the smaller circles. So hopefully it makes sense. This is iteration 1, so at our original DLG and MLC transmission values. Iteration 2, we increased our DLG from 0.115 to 0.14, kept the MLC transmission the same. And so what that did is it brought down the percent difference for the VMAT and the IMRT plans for both the low dose and the high dose. So we see we're getting closer to 0% here for all of these. We're not done yet though. So if we increase the MLC transmission to 1.85%, we get a little bit of improvement with the high dose. We're getting a little bit further from 0% with the low dose for IMRT. So, okay, so let's, instead of tweaking the MLC transmission further, let's go back to the original transmission value and increase the DLG yet again. And this, we're seeing a little bit less of a spread in the data. We're getting closer again to 0% from iteration 3, basically closer to 0% for IMRT low dose. This VMAT, which is our highest disagreement, and the high dose is still closer to 0%. Let's try one more value, 1.85% for the MLC transmission and this higher DLG value, 0.16. We do see a little bit improvement in the high dose region for both VMAT and IMRT, but the low dose is starting to get further from 0. So actually, for this example, just given what the clinical goals are here, this is a 10x beam model. It's going to be treating conventional cases, no SRS SBRT. We thought, hey, iteration 4, those values were what we chose. So minimizing the spread and kind of the best mixture of minimizing the spread of the results as well as minimizing the average percent difference. So I don't say all of this to say this is exactly how you do it, but more so this is how I think about this process, and just to give you kind of a feel for how you could think about it as you analyze.
Quick clarification question on this process in DLG. DLG is specific to a particular energy, right? Or are they the same for all energies on a machine?
Yeah, so DLG is an energy specific parameter. So your 6x, so I don't share this to say use this specific DLG value. It's going to depend on your machine, your energy, and the results that you obtain. So the 6x, in our case, the 6x DLG is usually going to be a smaller value than what we see for 10x. So it depends on energy, and also even the flattening filter free modes, typically we see a different DLG value than beams. And I can go into that a little bit more, but yeah, that's the idea. So I'm going to go over a few summaries. I'm going to share a little bit about SRS versus conventional, and then we can just kind of open it up for any further questions and discussion. So the planning, the testing process, it goes from treatment planning to the QA plan to measurements, compile the results, and then you can adjust. Okay, so that's a big thing. Compile all the results, see where you're at overall, because you're adjusting the entire B model. You're not just adjusting for one specific plant. So some practical tips on adjusting parameters on approved B models. So if you have a B model that's already approved and you need to make adjustments. So we went over the process to create a completely separate machine and B model for testing. If for any reason that's not available, then we have to potentially use some caution here and think about what we're doing. So the first thing is just use caution. Before you make any changes or test out any parameters, let's think about what could go wrong when we're making these adjustments. Work as a team, discuss with other physicists to make sure you have thought of everything that can come up. If you're changing parameters in a beam model, make sure you're communicating with the relevant staff, with the doctors, with the treatment planners, anyone that could be affected. And then if you have to make changes to an approved beam model, make the changes likely after hours or on a weekend. Weekends are great for this. And then measure, actually calculate the plans that need to be calculated. If you need to switch back and forth, then you need to calculate and then reset the parameters for routine clinical use. One thing here is if we're having to change these over the weekend, then we also just want to verify the MLC parameter reset. So if you're changing these parameters and then changing them back, once you change them back, just have a baseline plan that you can use to recalculate and verify constancy of the plans. We always want to make sure that we're going back to what we expect. Then you can compare the calculations to the measured values, the calculations that you did in step 3. Ideally, we want to have a separate machine that we can use to test out these beam modeling parameters as we went through earlier. All right, so I mentioned this slide a few times now. The thing about SRS SBRT planning is typically, from my experience, the level of modulation that we see in IMRT and VMAT planning versus SRS and SBRT is different, and therefore the MLC parameters that best optimally give us the best agreement are also different. And so this is just looking at dose difference for a single beam model, looking at TG119 plans in orange versus SRS SBRT plans. And you can see immediately, visually, that there's a different level of agreement for the SRS SBRT plans versus the TG119. There's a systematic difference there. And so what the optimal DLG for the TG119 planning is different than for the representative SRS SBRT cases. If you're using this algorithm for primarily SRS and SBRT, then you're going to want to take that into account. All right. In conclusion, we can create a commissioning machine to test out parameters for the TPS model. This TPS model can be adjusted based on comparison of calculated measured doses for IMRT and VMAT plans. We have gone through a representative process for adjusting MLC parameters for learning purposes. And the next lecture is building on this. So it's on the topic of patient-specific and high-yield machine QA for IMRT. All right, so here are some of the references.